year is 1291. The Mediterranean coast trembles under the weight of history's final judgment. For nearly 2 centuries, the Crusader kingdoms have clung to this narrow strip of land, their white stone fortresses defying the armies of Islam. But now, outside the walls of Acre, the last great Christian city in the Holy Land, an army of unprecedented size has gathered, and they have brought weapons unlike anything the world has ever seen. This is the story of how the Mamluks, slave soldiers who became kings, engineered the fall of Christendom's final bastion. This is the story of siege engines so monstrous they had to be named. This is the story of a 92-ton stone projectile that shattered more than walls. It shattered an age. In the spring of 1291, as Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil's army assembled outside Acre's triple walls, the defenders looked out from their towers and saw their doom taking shape. Timber frames rose like skeletal giants against the horizon. The sound of hammers and saws echoed day and night. The Mamluks were building something terrible, something final. The Christians inside Acre knew what was coming. They had heard the stories. They had seen refugees streaming from fallen cities, bearing tales of stones that flew like thunderbolts, of towers that collapsed in a single devastating impact, of walls that had stood for centuries reduced to rubble in days. But knowing what was coming and being able to stop it were 2 very different things. Let me take you back to understand how we arrived at this moment. To understand the fall of Acre, we must first understand who the Mamluks were, and why this siege represented not just a military campaign, but the culmination of decades of preparation, innovation, and an almost religious determination to drive the Crusaders into the sea forever. The word Mamluk means owned in Arabic. These were men who began their lives as slaves, taken as boys from the Caucasus, from the steppes, from Turkish lands beyond the borders of Islam. They were purchased in slave markets, brought to Egypt and Syria, and trained in the barracks of Cairo and Damascus. They learned to ride before they could write. They mastered the composite bow, the lance, the sword, and the mace. They studied tactics and strategy. They became the finest cavalry in the medieval world. And through a remarkable twist of history, they seized power for themselves. In 1250, during the chaos of the 7th Crusade, the Mamluks murdered the last sultan of the Ayyubid dynasty and took control of Egypt. It was a moment that should have resulted in their execution, but instead, it marked the beginning of a new dynasty. The Mamluks understood something fundamental about power. It belongs to those strong enough to hold it, and they were very, very strong. Under Sultan Baybar, he united Syria and Egypt under one command. He neutralized the Mongol threat in the east, and then he turned his full attention to the Crusaders. One by one, the great Crusader fortresses fell. Caesarea in 1265, Arsuf in 1265, Safed in 1266, Jaffa in 1268. Antioch, one of the great prizes of the First Crusade, fell in 1268 after Baybar subjected it to 4 days of killing that left the streets running with blood. By 1291, only Acre remained, along with a handful of smaller coastal towns that would fall immediately once Acre was taken. Acre was different from the other cities. It was not just a fortress. It was a thriving commercial center, one of the wealthiest ports in the Mediterranean. Italian merchants from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa maintained fortified quarters within the city. The Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights each controlled their own sectors, complete with their own walls and towers. The city had survived one major siege in 1189 and 1191, when Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus had taken it from Saladin after a brutal 2-year campaign. The Christians believed those walls were impregnable. They had survived a major earthquake in 1202. In 1291, the city's permanent population was perhaps 20,000, but it was swollen with refugees from other fallen cities. Perhaps 30 to 40,000 people crowded within those walls when the Mamluk army appeared. Among them were 600 Knights Hospitaller, 300 Knights Templar, and perhaps another 1,000 mounted men-at-arms from various European kingdoms. The infantry numbered perhaps 14,000, a mix of professional soldiers, militia, and armed citizens. They were led by men who knew this was likely the end. Jean de Villiers was the master of the Knights Hospitaller, a veteran of decades of fighting in the Holy Land. Guillaume de Beaujeu was the master of the Knights Templar, a man in his 60s who had devoted his entire adult life to defending the Crusader states. King Henry II of Jerusalem was present, though he was in reality King of Cyprus, the city of Jerusalem, having been lost nearly a century before. These men were not fools, they knew what was coming, but they would defend Acre because that was what they had pledged to do, until death released them from their vows. Sultan al-Ashraf, Khalil, was 27 years old when he ordered the Siege of Acre. He had become Sultan only a year earlier after the death of his father, Sultan Qalawun. Qalawun had been planning to take Acre when he died suddenly in November 1290, and there were whispers that Khalil had poisoned him to seize power. Whether true or not, Khalil felt the pressure of his tenuous position. He needed a victory to solidify his rule. Acre would provide that victory. On the 5th of April, 1291, the Mamluk army began to arrive outside Acre's walls. They came in contingents from across the Mamluk domains. From Egypt came 60,000 infantry and cavalry. From Damascus came another 30,000. From Hama came 10,000. From other cities and regions came additional thousands. The numbers given by medieval chroniclers are often exaggerated, but even conservative modern estimates suggest Khalil commanded a force of at least 60,000 professional soldiers, and perhaps as many as 90 to 100,000 men when support personnel, engineers, and laborers are included. This was not a raid. This was not a demonstration of force. This was total war, and the Mamluks had brought the tools to wage it. As the army encamped in a vast semicircle around Acre's landward walls, the defenders watched the horizon fill with tents. The Mamluk encampment stretched for miles. It was a city unto itself, complete with markets, mosques, administrative centers, and workshops. And in those workshops, the siege engines were being assembled. The Mamluks had spent decades perfecting the art of siege warfare. They had learned from the Crusaders, from the Byzantines, from the ancient texts of Roman and Greek engineers. They had captured European siege engineers and forced them to teach their secrets. They had studied the failures of previous sieges and designed solutions. The weapons they brought to Acre represented the cutting edge of medieval military technology. The primary siege weapons were the mangonels and the counterweight trebuchets, what the medieval world called petrary engines. The mangonel was the older design, using twisted ropes or sinews to provide the energy for throwing projectiles, but the counterweight trebuchet was the ultimate siege weapon of the medieval period, and the Mamluks had built them to a scale that defied belief. A trebuchet works on a simple principle: a long beam balanced on a fulcrum, with a heavy counterweight on the short end and a sling on the long end. When the counterweight is released, it falls, pulling the short end of the beam down and whipping the long end up, launching whatever is in the sling at tremendous velocity. The physics are elegant, the results are devastating. The largest of the Mamluk trebuchets were named as if they were living creatures. There was al-Mansuri, the victorious, which had been built originally by Sultan Qalawun. There was al-Gharib, the wondrous. There was al-Mujahidi, and there was one machine so large, so terrifying in its power, that it was simply called al-Kabir, the Great One. Contemporary sources tell us that al-Kabir could throw stones weighing up to 140 ratels. A ratel is a unit of weight that varied by region, but in Syria and Egypt, it was approximately equivalent to 1 pound in modern terms. This means al-Kabir was throwing projectiles that weighed over 60 kilograms, about 130 pounds, but some sources suggest even larger projectiles. The Templar of Tyre, an anonymous chronicler who witnessed the siege, mentioned stones so large that 2 men could not encircle them with their arms. Modern calculations suggest the very largest stones thrown at Acre may have weighed as much as 150 kilograms, over 300 pounds. To put this in perspective, imagine a boulder the size of a large beach ball, composed of solid limestone, flying through the air at perhaps 60 to 70 miles per hour, and then impacting a stone wall. The kinetic energy involved is staggering. These projectiles didn't just crack walls, they pulverized them. They created shock waves that propagated through the masonry, weakening structures dozens of meters from the point of impact. But the Mamluks didn't just throw stones. They threw a variety of projectiles designed for different purposes. Incendiary pots filled with naft, a type of petroleum-based fire weapon similar to Greek fire, were lobbed into the city to start fires. Loads of smaller stones were used like enormous shotgun blasts against massed defenders on the walls. Dead animals, both to spread disease and to demoralize the defenders, were occasionally used. And in at least one recorded instance, the Mamluks loaded a trebuchet with the severed heads of captured crusaders and launched them over the walls. The process of building these trebuchets was itself an enormous undertaking. The main beam of a large trebuchet might be 40 to 50 feet long, hewn from a single massive tree trunk. The counterweight box had to be built to hold tons of stones or sand. The frame had to be sturdy enough to withstand the tremendous forces generated with each shot, yet also needed to be slightly flexible to absorb shock. Skilled carpenters, engineers, and hundreds of laborers worked for weeks to construct each machine. The Mamluks brought at least 92 siege engines to Acre. Some sources say as many as 100. Not all of these were large trebuchets. Many were smaller mangonels. Some were traction trebuchets, powered by teams of men pulling on ropes rather than by counterweights. But the presence of so many machines meant that the bombardment could be continuous, relentless, never giving the defenders a moment to rest or repair the damage. The siege engines were positioned at carefully calculated ranges, typically between 100 and 200 meters from the walls. At this distance, they were close enough to be accurate, but far enough to be relatively safe from counterfire from the city's own defensive artillery. The Mamluks built protective barriers of timber and earth around each engine, creating fortified positions that the defenders, crossbows and small catapults, could not easily damage. But the siege engines were only part of the Mamluk arsenal. They also brought siege towers, massive wooden structures that could be rolled up to the walls on wheels, allowing soldiers to fight at the same level as the defenders on the ramparts. These towers were faced with green hides to protect against fire, and they were filled with archers and crossbowmen who could pour projectiles down onto the defenders, while swordsmen prepared to leap across to the walls when the towers were brought close enough. The Mamluks also deployed miners. While the trebuchets hammered at the walls from above, teams of engineers dug tunnels beneath them. Medieval mining was a precise and dangerous art. Miners would dig a tunnel under a section of wall, shoring up the tunnel with timber supports as they went. Once the tunnel extended far enough under the wall, they would pack it with combustible materials, firewood and animal fat, and then set it alight and flee. As the timber supports burned away, the tunnel would collapse, and the wall above would fall into the resulting cavity. The defenders of Acre knew all about mining, and they employed counter-miners who dug their own tunnels, listening for the sound of enemy digging, trying to intercept the Mamluk miners before they could reach the walls. When two mining operations met underground, brutal hand-to-hand combat would erupt in the narrow, dark tunnels. Men fought with knives and short swords in spaces where they couldn't even stand upright. Combatants would emerge from these underground battles covered in mud and blood, if they emerged at all. On the seaside, Acre was protected by a strong Venetian and Genoese fleet. Galleys patrolled the waters, preventing the Mamluks from completely encircling the city. This lifeline meant that supplies and reinforcements could still reach the city, at least in theory. In practice, as the siege dragged on and the danger became more apparent, fewer and fewer ships were willing to risk the approach. Sailors are pragmatic. They could see which way the wind was blowing. The Mamluks had learned from previous sieges not to neglect the naval aspect of warfare. They brought their own galleys and positioned archers along the shoreline to harass Christian shipping. More importantly, they built floating platforms, essentially large rafts protected with timber screens, from which they could launch projectiles at the seaward walls. These floating batteries were something new, an innovation that the Crusaders had not anticipated. Suddenly, walls that had been considered safe because they faced the sea came under fire. The bombardment began in earnest on the 8th of April, just 3 days after the Mamluk army had finished encamping. The sound must have been unlike anything the medieval world had heard before. The crack of releasing counterweights, the whoosh of beams whipping through the air, the thunder of stones striking walls, the crash of masonry falling, and underlying it all, the screams of wounded men and the prayers of the terrified. This was the soundtrack of apocalypse. The Mamluks concentrated their fire on specific sections of the wall, particularly near the gates and towers. The strategy was to focus overwhelming force on a limited area, creating breaches that could be exploited. The Tower of King Hugh came under immediate and devastating fire. Day after day, hour after hour, the stones rained down. The defenders tried to repair the damage at night, hauling baskets of rubble to fill the gaps, erecting timber supports to shore up weakened sections. But the work they accomplished in one night was undone in an hour the next morning. Inside the city, life became a nightmare. No place was truly safe. The largest trebuchets could reach the center of the city, and stones would occasionally crash through the roofs of houses and churches. Families huddled in cellars, the streets emptied except for soldiers rushing to their posts. The markets closed. The normal rhythms of life stopped entirely. Food supplies were adequate at the start of the siege, but as weeks passed, shortages began to appear. Not from lack of food itself, but from the increasing difficulty of distributing it. Movement through the city became dangerous as buildings collapsed and rubble blocked streets. Wells were contaminated by debris. Disease began to spread in the overcrowded conditions. For the soldiers on the walls, life was pure hell. They stood their watches in a rain of projectiles, never knowing when the next stone would come smashing through the battlements. Crossbow bolts flew constantly from the Mamluk siege towers. At night, the Mamluks would launch incendiary pots, turning sections of the walls into infernos of burning naft that could not be extinguished with water. Men caught in these fires burned alive inside their armor. The defenders had their own artillery, of course. Acre's walls were equipped with defensive trebuchets and mangonels, and the defenders used them to fire back at the Mamluk siege engines. But they were vastly outnumbered. For every stone the Christians launched, 10 came back at them. Some of the Mamluk engineers began to play games, seeing who could land a stone closest to the enemy engines, creating an informal competition that the Sultan reportedly encouraged with prizes. As April turned to May, the damage to the outer wall became catastrophic. The Tower of King Hugh was little more than a pile of rubble. The Tower of the English had been struck so many times that entire sections of wall between the towers had collapsed. The Mamluks prepared for the first major assault. On the 4th of May, the drums began to beat in the Mamluk camp. This was the signal. Thousands of soldiers formed up in assault columns. The siege towers were rolled forward, their wooden wheels creaking under the enormous weight. Scaling ladders were distributed. The soldiers carried wicker shields to protect against projectiles from above. They wore padded armor, leather and cloth layered together, because metal armor was too heavy for assault troops who needed to climb walls and fight for hours in the spring heat. The assault began at dawn. Trumpets blared. The trebuchets increased their rate of fire, throwing everything they had at the walls to suppress the defenders. The siege towers rumbled forward, pushed by teams of men protected behind the tower's bulk. Thousands of infantry rushed toward the walls carrying ladders. The defenders fought with desperate courage. They pushed the ladders away with long poles. They poured boiling water and heated sand down on the attackers. They shot crossbow bolts until their fingers bled from drawing the strings. The Knights Templar and Hospitaller, men who had trained their entire lives for precisely this kind of close combat, led counterattacks wherever the Mamluks gained a foothold on the walls. The fighting raged all day. Bodies piled up at the base of the walls. The Mamluks would surge forward, plant their ladders, climb desperately while defenders tried to dislodge them, gain the wall top, fight in brutal hand-to-hand combat, and then either be thrown back or occasionally, horribly, overwhelm a section of wall before reinforcements arrived to push them back again. It was a meat grinder. It was mathematics. The Mamluks could afford losses that would have destroyed the Christian army. They had the numbers. The Christians did not. As the sun set on the 4th of May, the Mamluks withdrew. They had not broken through. But they had learned where the defenses were weakest. They had tested the defenders' stamina, and they had demonstrated that they were willing to spend lives to take this city. The bombardment continued. The siege engines never stopped. Crews worked in shifts, so that at any given moment, day or night, stones were falling on Acre. The defenders tried to catch brief moments of sleep whenever they could, but the noise made rest almost impossible. Men began to show signs of what we would now recognize as severe combat stress. They flinched at sounds, they stared vacantly, some simply broke down weeping. Morale might have collapsed entirely, but the military orders held firm. The Templars and Hospitallers were more than just soldiers. They were monks who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They had spent years preparing for martyrdom. This was, in their minds, precisely what they had trained for. Their presence stiffened the resolve of the regular soldiers. If these holy warriors could face death with prayers on their lips, then surely others could stand beside them. The 3rd week of May brought disaster. The Mamluks succeeded in completing a mine under the Tower of the King. On the 15th of May, they set the fire. The tower shook. Smoke poured from cracks in the masonry. And then, with a sound like the earth breaking, the tower collapsed. A huge section of the outer wall came down with it, creating a breach 20 meters wide. The Mamluks immediately rushed the breach. This was the moment they had been working toward for 6 weeks. Thousands of soldiers poured forward into a storm of defensive fire. The Christians had prepared for this. They had built an inner barricade behind the outer wall. They had positioned their best troops at the breach. But the Mamluk numbers were overwhelming. Guillaume de Beaujeu, the master of the temple, led a counterattack personally. He was 60 years old, but he fought like a man half his age, his sword rising and falling, his voice calling encouragement to his men. An arrow struck him in the chest, penetrating between the plates of his armor. He staggered but did not fall. He continued fighting. Another arrow hit him. He called to his men to hold the line, and then finally, he collapsed. His knights carried him from the field. He died that evening, having bought precious hours for the defense. The breach was held that day, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The outer wall was now indefensible. The Christians abandoned it and fell back to the middle wall. This was a disaster for morale. The outer wall, that mighty fortification that had protected Acre for a century, was gone. The city felt suddenly smaller, more vulnerable. Sultan Khalil offered terms. He sent an envoy under flag of truce, proposing that the Christians could leave peacefully, taking their possessions with them, if they surrendered the city immediately. It was, by medieval standards, a generous offer. But the Templars and Hospitallers rejected it. They argued that any surrender would be a betrayal of their oaths. They would defend Acre to the last man. Others in the city desperately wanted to accept Khalil's terms, but the military orders held sway. In truth, there was another calculation at work. The leaders knew that even if Khalil honored his terms, which was far from certain given Mamluk history, the evacuation of 40,000 people by sea would take weeks. During that time, they would be completely at the Mamluks' mercy. The military orders did not trust Khalil to allow them to leave unmolested. Better to fight and die with honor than to be slaughtered on the beaches. The bombardment of the middle wall began immediately. The Mamluks, brought their siege engines forward, positioning them in the ruins of the outer defenses. Now firing from much closer range, their accuracy increased dramatically. The middle wall, though strong, had not been designed to withstand the kind of punishment the outer wall had absorbed. It began to crumble faster than the defenders could repair it. On the 18th of May, King Henry II of Cyprus made a final attempt at negotiation. He sent envoys to Khalil's tent, offering an enormous tribute if the Sultan would lift the siege. Khalil's response was unambiguous. "When I see the last crusader dead or driven into the sea, then and only then will I lift my siege. There will be no negotiation. There will be no terms. Acre will fall, or I will die in the attempt." The defenders prepared for the final assault. It would come soon. Everyone could feel it. The wall was breached in multiple places now. Mamluk banners had been planted in the ruins of the outer fortifications. The siege towers were being brought forward for one last push. Priests moved through the city hearing confessions. Soldiers wrote final letters to families they would never see again. Mothers clutched their children and prayed to the Virgin Mary for deliverance that would not come. On the morning of the 18th of May, 1291, the drums began to beat. But this time they did not stop. They beat continuously, a thundering rhythm that echoed off the walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. This was it, the final assault. The Mamluk army attacked in waves. The first wave was composed of volunteers, men promised extra pay and religious merit for being first to enter the city. They were, effectively, expendable troops meant to exhaust the defenders and identify weak points. They came in a human flood, thousands of men screaming, running toward the walls with ladders and grappling hooks. The defenders met them with everything they had. Crossbow bolts and arrows flew in clouds. Stones were hurled down. Boiling oil was poured from cauldrons. The Christians fought like demons because they knew this was their last day on earth. The first wave broke against the walls and fell back, leaving hundreds of dead. The second wave came immediately after, giving the defenders no time to rest. These were regular infantry, professional soldiers of the Mamluk armies. They were better armored, better trained, and more disciplined than the first wave. They brought siege towers up to the walls, and from these towers, Mamluk archers poured fire down onto the defenders. Under this covering fire, infantry stormed the breaches. Fighting on the walls became hand-to-hand chaos. Men grappled and stabbed at close quarters. Knights in full armor hacked down at lighter-armed Mamluks trying to climb over the rubble. No quarter was asked or given. This was killing reduced to its most basic form, you or me, life or death, nothing else matters. The Knights Hospitaller, defending their section of the wall near St. Anthony's Gate, repulsed attack after attack. Jean de Villiers, their master, fought alongside his men despite his advanced age. At some point during the battle, he was severely wounded, struck by multiple weapons. His knights managed to evacuate him to a galley in the harbor. He would be one of the few leaders to escape Acre alive, though he would die from his wounds a few months later. By midday, the Mamluks had secured several sections of the middle wall. They were now inside the city, fighting in the streets. The defense began to dissolve into isolated pockets of resistance. The Italian merchant quarters organized their own defenses, barricading streets and trying to hold the waterfront so they could evacuate by ship. The inner wall, the last line of defense, was never designed to withstand a siege. It was relatively low and thin, meant more as an administrative boundary than a fortification. As Mamluk soldiers poured through the breaches in the middle wall, the inner wall was quickly overrun. By evening, organized resistance had collapsed. The Mamluks were in the city in force, and what followed was a massacre. The soldiers, having endured weeks of siege and hundreds of casualties, were not in a merciful mood. They moved through the streets, killing every man they found. Women and children were taken as slaves. The contemporary accounts speak of blood running in the streets so thick that it soaked through shoes. The churches were looted and burned. The hospital of the Knights of St. John was set ablaze with wounded soldiers still inside. Some defenders made a final stand in the fortified compounds of the military orders. The Templar castle at the southwest corner of the city held out for more than a week after the main walls fell. The Templars pulled down the bridge connecting their fortress to the city and prepared to fight to the death. Sultan Khalil offered them terms again. This time, with all hope gone, they accepted. They agreed to surrender in exchange for safe passage for themselves and the refugees who had fled to their fortress. It was a trap. When the Templar commander, Pierre de Sévry, opened the gates to allow Mamluk troops to enter and accept the formal surrender, the Mamluks immediately began seizing women and children to be sold as slaves. The Templars, enraged at this betrayal, fell upon the Mamluks and killed them all. They closed the gates again and prepared for the end. The Mamluks brought up their siege engines and began pounding the Templar fortress. On the 28th of May, they succeeded in undermining one of the walls. But when the mine was fired and the wall collapsed, so much damage was done to the fortress's foundations that the entire structure began to come down. The Mamluks who had rushed into the breach found themselves buried under thousands of tons of falling masonry. 2,000 Mamluk soldiers died in the collapse, along with the remaining Templars and the refugees they had been protecting. It was a bitter end to the siege. The Mamluks had their victory, but at the cost of thousands of their own troops and the destruction of much of the city they had fought so hard to take. In the weeks following the fall of Acre, the remaining Crusader cities surrendered without a fight. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut all opened their gates and negotiated evacuations. By August of 1291, not a single Crusader stronghold remained on the mainland of the Levant. The human cost of the Siege of Acre was staggering. Of the 40,000 people inside the city when the siege began, perhaps 10,000 escaped by sea. The rest were killed or enslaved. The Mamluk losses were probably between 10 and 15,000 dead, though precise numbers are impossible to determine. The city itself was so badly damaged that Sultan Khalil ordered it demolished entirely to prevent it from ever being used as a bridgehead for a new crusade. The walls were torn down, the harbor was filled with rubble, and the site was left desolate. So what were the decisive factors in the Mamluk victory? Why did Acre fall when it had withstood other sieges? The answer lies in the combination of overwhelming force, superior siege technology, and the Mamluks' willingness to sustain losses that would have caused other armies to abandon the siege. The siege engines were the key. The Mamluks brought artillery on a scale that the medieval world had never seen before. 92 siege engines, hammering at the walls continuously, throwing thousands of projectiles every day, was something no fortification could withstand indefinitely. Previous sieges had failed because the attackers could not maintain the bombardment long enough to create decisive breaches. The Mamluks solved this problem by bringing enough engines that they could operate continuously, with crews rotating to prevent fatigue. The counterweight trebuchet, refined to its ultimate form in machines like al-Kabir, was the crown jewel of Mamluk siege technology. These machines represented decades of accumulated knowledge, incremental improvements in design, and massive investment in materials and skilled labor. Each large trebuchet cost as much as a warship to build and required a team of engineers to operate. The Mamluks built dozens of them for this single siege. This was industrial-scale warfare, medieval style. The Mamluks also benefited from having learned from their previous sieges. They knew exactly how to coordinate different types of attacks: bombardment to create breaches, mining to undermine key towers, assault troops to exploit weaknesses, and naval forces to prevent relief and resupply. This was combined arms warfare executed at a level of sophistication that most medieval armies could not match. But technology alone does not win wars. The Mamluks succeeded because they were willing to pay the price. They absorbed horrific casualties in their assaults and kept coming. They maintained discipline and focus through weeks of grinding siege work. They had the logistics to support a 100,000-man army in the field for nearly 2 months, and they had a leadership that was absolutely committed to taking Acre, no matter the cost. For the Crusaders, the fall of Acre was the end of a 200-year dream. When Pope Urban II had called the First Crusade in 1095, he had promised that God would grant victory to those who took up the cross. For a while, it seemed he was right. Jerusalem fell, Antioch fell, Christian kingdoms were established, but God, it seemed, had only been willing to loan the Holy Land to the Crusaders, not grant it to them permanently. The failure to hold the Crusader states can be attributed to many factors. The Crusaders were always a small minority in a hostile land. They were divided among themselves, with different military orders and European kingdoms pursuing competing agendas. They could not match the population resources of the Muslim world, and ultimately, they faced in the Mamluks an enemy that was their equal or superior in military skill, and vastly superior in numbers and resources. The siege engines that destroyed Acre went on to serve the Mamluks for decades. The technology continued to develop. Later, Mamluk sieges featured even larger trebuchets, throwing even heavier projectiles. But Acre remained the most significant test of this technology. The siege that demonstrated decisively that no medieval fortification could stand against properly applied siege artillery. The fall of Acre sent shockwaves through Europe. This was not just another defeat. This was the complete loss of the Holy Land. Popes called for new crusades, but the enthusiasm that had driven earlier crusades was gone. A few small expeditions were mounted, but nothing that could challenge Mamluk dominance. The age of the Crusades was effectively over. For the Mamluks, the victory at Acre solidified their power. Sultan Khalil returned to Cairo in triumph, though he would be assassinated just 2 years later in the brutal power struggles that characterized Mamluk politics. But the dynasty he helped establish would rule Egypt and Syria for more than 2.5 centuries, until the Ottoman conquest in 1517. The siege engines themselves, those monstrous machines with their Persian names and their biblical power to cast down walls, eventually became obsolete. By the mid-14th century, gunpowder artillery was beginning to appear in the Middle East. Cannons would eventually replace trebuchets because cannon fire was more powerful, more accurate, and required fewer skilled operators. But for a brief period, roughly from 1250 to 1350, the counterweight trebuchet was the ultimate weapon of siege warfare, and the Mamluks were its masters. Walking through what remains of Crusader Acre today, in the modern Israeli city of Akko, you can still see traces of those mighty walls. Sections of Crusader masonry are incorporated into later Ottoman fortifications. Underground, the vast halls of the Hospitaller fortress still exist, vaulted chambers that once stored weapons and supplies for the defense. And if you stand on the waterfront and look inland toward where the walls once stood, you can almost hear the echo of those siege engines, the crash of stones, the screams of dying men, the last defiant prayers of a kingdom that knew its time had come. The Siege of Acre in 1291 was not just a battle. It was the end of an era, accomplished through the systematic application of military engineering at a scale the medieval world had never before witnessed. The secret weapons that crushed Acre were not secret in the sense of being unknown. The Crusaders knew about trebuchets. They had their own siege engines. But what they did not have was the industrial capacity, the organizational capability, and the sheer bloody-minded determination to bring nearly 100 of these machines to bear on a single city and to maintain their fire for 7 weeks without pause. That was the Mamluk's secret weapon. Not any single piece of technology, but the entire system of warfare they had developed, combining engineering excellence with strategic patience, overwhelming resources, and absolute ruthlessness. They understood that siegecraft was not about individual acts of heroism or brilliant tactical maneuvers. It was about logistics, mathematics, and the willingness to grind an enemy down through sheer, relentless pressure. The aftermath of Acre's fall revealed another aspect of the Mamluk strategy that made their victory possible. Sultan Khalil did not simply destroy the city and move on. He systematically dismantled the entire coastal infrastructure that had supported the Crusader presence for 2 centuries. Every port, every fortress, every fortified town along the coast was either demolished or so thoroughly destroyed that it could not serve as a landing point for future crusading expeditions. The port of Acre itself was deliberately ruined. The Mamluks broke up the massive stone breakwaters that had protected the harbor. They filled the anchorages with rubble from the demolished buildings. They destroyed the warehouses and the customs houses. When they were finished, Acre was not just conquered, it was erased as a functioning commercial center. The great merchant families of Venice and Genoa, who had made fortunes trading through Acre, lost everything. Ships that arrived months later, unaware of the city's fall, found only ruins and empty beaches. This scorched earth policy served multiple purposes. It denied future crusaders any foothold on the coast. It eliminated the economic incentives that had sustained European interest in the Levant. And it sent a clear message. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land was not merely defeated. It was finished, permanently and irrevocably. For the military orders, the fall of Acre was a catastrophe from which they never fully recovered. The Knights Templar, already weakened by their losses at Acre, would be suppressed by King Philip IV of France just 16 years later in 1307. The charges against them, heresy and corruption, were almost certainly fabricated, but the Templars no longer had the military power or the moral authority to defend themselves. Their purpose, defending the Holy Land, had ceased to exist. They became vulnerable, and their vast wealth made them targets. The Knights Hospitaller survived by reinventing themselves. They relocated first to Cyprus, then to Rhodes, and finally to Malta, transforming from a land-based military order into a naval power that fought Muslim shipping in the Mediterranean. But they were forever changed. The hospital at Acre, that vast complex where they had tended the sick and prepared for war, was gone. The institutional memory, the traditions, the physical presence in the Holy Land that had defined them for 2 centuries, all of it was lost in those terrible days of May 1291. The Teutonic Knights, the German military order, shifted their focus northward to the Baltic, where they spent the next century conquering and Christianizing Prussia and Lithuania. They too survived, but as something different from what they had been. The Holy Land was a closed chapter. For the common soldiers who survived the siege, life after Acre was difficult. Those who escaped by ship found themselves scattered across Cyprus, Rhodes, and the port cities of Italy. Many were wounded, physically or mentally broken by what they had endured. Medieval society had no concept of post-traumatic stress, no support systems for damaged veterans. These men simply had to live with their memories, with the sounds and smells and sights that haunted them. Some of the survivors left accounts of the siege. The Templar of Tyre, whose chronicle provides some of our most detailed information about the fall of Acre, was probably present during the siege, though his exact role is unclear. His account is filled with technical details about the siege engines, the breaches, the assaults, but also with a profound sense of loss. He writes of the siege not as a military defeat, but as a spiritual catastrophe, the moment when God turned his face away from the Christians in the east. Another account comes from Abu Fida, a Mamluk prince, who was present at the siege as a young man. His perspective is naturally very different. He describes the siege as a great victory, a triumph of Islamic arms over the infidel. But even his account, filtered through the conventions of Arabic military historiography, conveys the scale of the destruction and the horrific nature of the fighting. He mentions that the bombardment was so intense that the air was constantly filled with dust from pulverized masonry. He describes bodies stacked like cordwood in the streets. He talks about the fires that burned for days after the city fell, consuming the rubble and the dead alike. The siege engines that made this destruction possible were marvels of medieval engineering, but they were also instruments of terror. Imagine being a defender on the walls, watching these massive wooden structures on the horizon, knowing that each one could hurl a projectile capable of killing dozens of men, of demolishing a house, of smashing through supposedly impregnable walls. The psychological impact of being under constant bombardment cannot be overstated. Modern military analysts have tried to calculate the rate of fire these engines could maintain. A well-trained crew operating a large counterweight trebuchet could probably launch one projectile every 10 to 15 minutes, accounting for the time needed to load the sling, position the counterweight, and aim. With 92 engines operating in shifts, that means the Mamluks were throwing perhaps 400 to 500 projectiles at the city every hour, day and night, for 7 weeks. That's a total of perhaps 200,000 projectiles over the course of the siege. Not all of these were massive stones, of course. Many were smaller projectiles, incendiaries, or loads of gravel. But even accounting for this, the sheer volume of fire was unprecedented. No other siege in the medieval period approached this level of sustained bombardment. The closest comparison might be the artillery barrages of World War I, centuries later, when industrial-scale warfare first made such sustained fire truly routine. The cost of maintaining this bombardment was enormous. The Mamluks had to transport thousands of tons of stones to the siege site. They had to maintain the siege engines, replacing damaged parts, adjusting aim, coordinating fire. They had to feed and pay the enormous army. Contemporary estimates suggest that Sultan Khalil spent 1 million dinars on the siege, a sum so vast it's difficult to comprehend in modern terms. It would be equivalent to the entire annual revenue of a major European kingdom. But Khalil could afford it. The Mamluk Sultanate controlled Egypt, one of the richest agricultural regions in the world, and Syria, which controlled the trade routes between Asia and Europe. The Mamluks were cash-rich, in a way the Crusader states never were. They could spend money on a scale that their enemies could not match. This financial power translated directly into military power. More soldiers, more supplies, more engines, more everything. The Crusaders, by contrast, were always financially strained. The military orders had significant resources, but they were spread thin across multiple fronts. The Italian merchant cities were wealthy, but their interest in the Crusader states was primarily commercial, not military. They would defend their warehouses and their trading privileges, but they were not willing to bankrupt themselves for an increasingly hopeless cause. When the Genoese and Venetian galleys fled Acre's harbor in the final days of the siege, carrying refugees but also leaving thousands behind, it was a cold calculation of profit and loss. There was no profit in dying for a lost cause. European reinforcements, which might have saved Acre, never came in sufficient numbers. King Edward, the First of England, who as Prince Edward had crusaded in the Holy Land in the 1270s, sent money but no troops. The Pope issued calls for a new crusade, but the response was minimal. France was embroiled in conflicts with England. The Holy Roman Empire was dealing with internal disputes. Italy was consumed by the wars between Guelphs and Ghibellines. Everyone had more immediate concerns than the Holy Land. This lack of support meant that the defenders of Acre were essentially on their own, facing a Mamluk army that represented the full military might of a major empire. The disparity in resources was so great that the outcome was never really in doubt. The only question was how long Acre could hold out, and how many would die in its defense. The Christians did receive some reinforcements during the siege. King Henry II of Cyprus brought perhaps 100 knights and a few hundred infantry in late April. They arrived by sea, managing to slip through the Mamluk naval cordon. But these numbers were insignificant compared to the size of the Mamluk army. They were drops of water trying to stop a flood. The naval aspect of the siege deserves more attention because it reveals another dimension of Mamluk military capability. The Mamluks were primarily a land power, famous for their cavalry, but they had developed a competent navy specifically to deal with the Crusader states. Their galleys were not as sophisticated as the Venetian or Genoese vessels, but they didn't need to be. The Mamluks used their ships primarily for transport and for harassing Christian shipping, not for major naval battles. More importantly, the Mamluks positioned siege engines on the shoreline and on floating platforms, bringing the seaward walls under fire. This was innovative. Medieval naval warfare generally involved ship-to-ship combat or amphibious landings. The idea of using shore-based artillery to support a siege of coastal fortifications was relatively new. The Crusaders had not seriously prepared for this contingency. Their seaward walls were strong, but not as strong as the landward fortifications, because historically the sea had provided protection, not additional threat. When stones began falling on the seaward walls and on ships in the harbor, the Christians realized they had a serious problem. The harbor was no longer entirely safe. Ships trying to evacuate refugees came under fire. Several were hit and damaged. This added to the panic inside the city and made evacuation more difficult. It was another example of the Mamluks' combined arms approach, using every available weapon system to multiply the pressure on the defenders. The use of incendiary weapons also deserves mention. The Mamluks regularly launched clay pots filled with naft, a petroleum-based substance that burned intensely and could not be extinguished with water. When these pots shattered on impact, they spread burning liquid over a wide area. The naft would stick to anything it touched, continuing to burn. Men caught in naft attacks suffered horrible deaths, their skin and flesh burning even as they tried desperately to scrape the substance off. The psychological impact of these weapons was as important as their physical effects. Fire is one of humanity's primal fears. Soldiers could steel themselves to face swords and arrows, but fire was different. Fire was chaotic, unpredictable, agonizing. The threat of fire attack kept defenders on edge, made them hesitant to mass together, reduced their effectiveness. The Mamluks also used biological weapons, though not in the modern sense. They would occasionally catapult dead animals, particularly horses, into the city. The corpses would rot in the spring heat, creating a terrible stench and potentially spreading disease. Whether this actually caused disease outbreaks is unclear, but it certainly affected morale. The message was clear: this city is already dead. It just doesn't know it yet. Psychological warfare was an integral part of the Mamluk approach. Before the siege even began, they sent agents into the city to spread rumors about the size of their army, the power of their siege engines, the inevitability of their victory. During the siege, they would sometimes deliberately fire projectiles at specific targets to demonstrate their accuracy. A church, a palace, a particular tower. The message was, we can hit whatever we want, whenever we want, and there is nothing you can do to stop us. After successful assaults, the Mamluks would parade captured banners and prisoners in sight of the walls. They wanted the defenders to see their comrades bound and humiliated, to understand that defeat meant not just death, but dishonor. When Guillaume de Beaujeu died, the Mamluks made sure word reached the city immediately. They wanted the defenders to know that their greatest champion was gone. Inside the city, morale was sustained by religious fervor and by the sheer absence of alternatives. The priests preached that those who died defending Acre would be martyrs, guaranteed entry into heaven. The military orders reminded their men of their vows, their duty, their honor, and there was nowhere to run. The only escape was by sea, and there were not enough ships for everyone. Most of the defenders knew they would stay in Acre until the end, whatever that end might be. This created a strange kind of freedom. Men who know they are going to die often fight with a ferocity that men who hope to survive cannot match. The defenders of Acre had nothing left to lose. Some of them seemed to embrace this, throwing themselves into the fighting with reckless abandon. Contemporary accounts speak of individual knights performing extraordinary feats, holding breaches single-handed against dozens of attackers, leading desperate sorties against siege engines, fighting on even after receiving wounds that should have been fatal. These acts of heroism could not change the outcome, but they mattered to the men who performed them and to those who witnessed them. In a medieval worldview, how you died was as important as how you lived. A good death, a brave death, redeemed a life. These men died well, and that meant something. The final assault on the 18th of May was the culmination of everything the Mamluks had prepared for. They attacked simultaneously at multiple points, preventing the defenders from concentrating their forces. The siege towers reached the walls. Assault troops poured through the breaches. Scaling ladders went up everywhere at once. The trebuchets maintained their fire, not at the walls now, but into the city itself, targeting the areas where reserves were forming up. The sheer scale of the assault overwhelmed the defense. There were simply too many Mamluks attacking too many places at once. The defenders fought magnificently, but they were exhausted, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. Crossbow bolts ran short, stones for throwing down at attackers were used up. Even boiling oil, that staple of siege defense, was in short supply. By noon, Mamluk soldiers were fighting in the streets. The defense fragmented into isolated strong points. The Italian quarters barricaded themselves and tried to negotiate separate surrenders. The military orders fell back to their fortified compounds. King Henry II fled to the harbor and escaped by ship, along with several hundred nobles and knights. His departure, while militarily sensible, was seen by many as abandonment. The king had left his people to die. The massacre that followed the breach of the walls was typical of medieval siege warfare. When a city refused terms and was taken by storm, the attackers were traditionally allowed to sack it. This was understood as both punishment for resistance and reward for the soldiers who had risked their lives in the assault. But understanding the custom doesn't make the reality any less horrific. Mamluk soldiers went through the city methodically, street by street, house by house. Men were killed on sight. Women and children were rounded up to be sold as slaves. The slave markets of Cairo and Damascus would be flooded with Acre refugees in the coming months. Driving down prices, young women fetched the highest prices. Children were valuable because they could be trained from an early age. Older women and men had little value and were often killed simply because they weren't worth the trouble of transporting. The churches were particular targets. They were stripped of their treasures. Their gold and silver melted down or carried off as loot. The religious art, the icons and paintings and statues, were destroyed as idolatrous. The Church of the Holy Cross, where the true cross itself had once been kept, was burned. The Cathedral of the Holy Spirit was looted and then demolished. These were not just buildings, they were symbols of 200 years of Christian presence in the Holy Land. Their destruction was symbolic as well as practical. The fortified compound of the Knights Hospitaller fell on the 19th of May. The Hospitallers fought to the death, as their rule required. Contemporary accounts say that not a single Hospitaller surrendered until their master, Jean de Villiers, ordered them to evacuate. Even then, many chose to remain and die fighting. Their compound was set ablaze, and the smoke could be seen for miles. The Templar fortress held out longer. The Templars were the most experienced military engineers in the Crusader states. Their fortress in Acre was a castle within a city, with its own walls, towers, and fortifications. They had supplies to last months, but they were completely isolated. The city around them had fallen. There was no hope of relief. They were simply delaying the inevitable. When the Mamluks brought the siege engines to bear on the Templar fortress, the outcome was predetermined. The walls that might have held against conventional assault could not stand against the sustained bombardment of multiple trebuchets. The stones fell day and night, widening cracks, creating breaches, bringing down towers. On the 25th of May, a section of wall collapsed. The Mamluks prepared for the final assault. The mine that brought down the Templar fortress on the 28th of May was probably not intended to cause such catastrophic damage. The Mamluk engineers were trying to bring down one wall, not the entire structure, but the fortress had been weakened by days of bombardment. Its foundations had been compromised. When the mine detonated, it triggered a cascade failure. The wall fell inward, pulling adjacent walls with it. The towers, their foundations undermined, toppled. the entire southeast corner of the fortress collapsed in a roar of breaking stone and screaming men. 2,000 Mamluk soldiers, who had rushed through the breach expecting an easy victory, were buried in the rubble. The remaining Templars died with them, along with the civilians who had taken refuge in the fortress. It was a Pyrrhic victory for the Templars, if it could be called a victory at all. They had killed 2,000 of their enemies, but they were all dead, and Acre had still fallen. The collapse of the Templar fortress marked the absolute end of Crusader Acre. There were no more strongpoints to fall back to, no more walls to defend. The city was in Mamluk hands, and the work of demolition began immediately. Sultan Khalil gave orders that Acre was to be rendered completely unusable as a port. Over the following months, thousands of workers dismantled what the siege had not destroyed. The walls were pulled down stone by stone. The harbor facilities were demolished. Buildings were torn apart. Anything of value was carried off. The rest was left to decay. Within a generation, Acre was a ghost town. Travelers passing through the area reported ruins overgrown with vegetation, empty streets haunted by memories. The great commercial center that had rivaled Venice and Constantinople in wealth and sophistication was gone. The city would not be rebuilt until the Ottoman period, centuries later, and even then, it never regained its former glory. The broader consequences of Acre's fall rippled through both Christian and Muslim worlds for decades. In Europe, the loss provoked soul-searching and recriminations. How had this happened? How had a cause that had inspired millions, that had sent kings and emperors crusading, that had seemed blessed by God himself, ended in such complete failure? Different people had different answers. Some blamed the military orders for their pride and internal conflicts. Some blamed the Italian merchants for caring more about profit than faith. Some blamed the European monarchs for abandoning the Holy Land. Some concluded that God was punishing Christianity for its sins. The calls for a new crusade continued for years, but they rang increasingly hollow. A few small expeditions were organized, but nothing substantial. The momentum was gone. The generation that had grown up believing in the Crusades was dying off, and the younger generation had other concerns. The world was changing. The great age of religious warfare was ending, to be replaced by the early stirrings of what would become the Renaissance and the Reformation. For the Muslim world, Acre's fall was celebrated as a great victory, the final expulsion of the Frankish invaders. Sultan Khalil was praised as a hero of Islam. Poets composed verses celebrating the siege. Chroniclers recorded the events in elaborate detail, often exaggerating the size of the Crusader forces to make the Mamluk victory seem even more impressive. The siege entered the mythology of Mamluk military prowess. But there were also lessons learned. The enormous cost of the siege, both in lives and treasure, made subsequent Mamluk rulers more cautious about undertaking major campaigns. The siege had demonstrated what was possible with sufficient resources and determination, but it had also shown the limits of even the most advanced medieval military technology. Cities could be taken, but the cost was high, sometimes prohibitively so. The siege engines themselves, those marvels of medieval engineering, were preserved and maintained for future campaigns. Some of them were used in later sieges in Syria and Anatolia, but they were gradually replaced as military technology evolved. By the time the Ottomans conquered the Mamluk Sultanate in 1517, trebuchets were already obsolete, replaced by cannon that could throw heavier projectiles farther and more accurately. Yet for a brief period, in the late 13th century, the counterweight trebuchet represented the pinnacle of military technology, and the Siege of Acre in 1291 represented the ultimate expression of that technology. Never before and never again would so many siege engines be concentrated against a single target. Never again would a medieval city endure such sustained, intensive bombardment. Acre was both the triumph and the sunset of the age of the trebuchet. For us, looking back across more than 7 centuries, the Siege of Acre offers lessons that transcend its immediate historical context. It demonstrates the importance of technological superiority, of logistics, of the willingness to commit fully to an objective. It shows how even the strongest defenses can be overcome by sufficient force intelligently applied. It reveals the human capacity for both extraordinary courage and terrible cruelty. The men who died at Acre, both Mamluk and Crusader, were products of their time, fighting for causes they believed in, using the weapons available to them. We can admire their courage without endorsing their causes. We can study their tactics without glorifying the violence. History is not about choosing sides, it's about understanding. The siege engines that destroyed Acre were secret weapons, only in the sense that the Crusaders did not fully appreciate what the Mamluks had developed until it was too late. The technology was known, the principles were understood, but the scale, the systematic application, the sheer industrial organization required to bring nearly 100 of these machines to bear on a single city. That was new. That was the Mamluks' innovation, and it changed the calculus of medieval warfare. In the end, Acre fell not because of any single brilliant stroke or secret weapon in the conventional sense. It fell because the Mamluks had built a military machine capable of sustaining the kind of grinding, relentless pressure that no medieval fortification could withstand indefinitely. They had the resources, the organization, the technology, and the will. The Crusaders had courage and faith, but those were not enough. As the sun set on the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem for the final time on that May evening in 1291, it marked the end of an era. The age of the Crusades was over. The Mamluks had won, and the siege engines, those terrible engines that had cast down the walls of Acre, stood silent on the empty plain. Monuments to the power of human ingenuity turned to the purposes of war.